Hello, everyone. Hello, Portland. Woo! It's my first time in Portland. I live in the US, so a lot of people think I'm Australian. Well, I mean, I was born in Australia, but I'm an American citizen. Live in Kansas City, and I was very excited to be picked to come to Portland this year because I've never been to this city before, and it's been so awesome. I don't want to go home, honestly. It's so awesome. So thank you everyone for coming to my panel, and we're going to jump into it. So we're going to talk about copy protection on everything from old computers to modern consoles. So this is not going to cover like extensively the entire thing of copy protection because there's so much to cover, but I'm going to pick out choice moments in time. And hopefully this is interesting for you guys and you'll enjoy it. And if there's time at the end, we'll take some questions. I'll try to go through this as quickly as I can because I definitely want to take questions from you guys as well. So just some housekeeping stuff. Modern Vintage Gamer. I'm on all social media, so just Google me, you'll find me. I'm a homebrew emulation developer on the original Xbox, PSP, 360, PlayStation 3 and the Switch. I ported Doom to the Switch in 45 minutes. I made a video on that, so check that out if you like Doom and Switch. And I also ported Diablo to the Switch on Homebrew, which got a lot of media attention, and some good and some bad. But it was all very, very positive in the end. It got me a lot of views, a lot of subscribers on my YouTube channel. Where did I get my start in development? A lot of people ask me, how did I begin, my journey? And the first computer I ever got was a Commodore VIC-20. And when my dad brought the computer home and I plugged it in, this is what I saw, right? So it's like, well, what do I do with this? But of course, there's the manual where you can type in your basic programs and play some games, but that kind of got pretty boring. I wanted to know how to play games on this thing, and I remember it came with one of these, which was a tape drive. And the tape drive was really easy to make duplicates, obviously. There was no copy protection back then. What you would do is you would just go to the store or you would go to school and swap games with your friends, and you would then take them home and then use something like this to make duplicates of the games. Really, really easy, right? It was a no-brainer. And that was really my first, and probably some of yours, experiences with copying of games. I mean, it was just the schoolyard copying that we did. It wasn't really harmful to anyone, but I guess in some ways it was. I mean, you are hurting the publisher of the game or the developer of the game. But it was really easy to do. You would just duplicate them on a tape-to-tape recorder. But what was interesting was, when I got a Commodore 64, for some reason, we would get load errors. That duplication thing wouldn't work the way that it did on the VIC-20, and I couldn't really figure out why. And what was actually going on was there was copy protection built into the cassettes. And what they did was when they mastered these cassettes, they used really, really weak signals, as weak as possible, but enough for the game to load on cassette and load correctly. So when you would try to duplicate it with a tape-to-tape recorder or a double tape deck, it would bring in hiss and noise into the mix, and it would really just mess up the copy. And that was the first copy protection on cassettes that I've ever had to deal with, and it never really worked. I mean, if you had a decent tape deck and good quality cassettes, and you had an EQ, you could boost the signals and adjust things. But you would probably try this over and over again until it worked. And it was really the first copy protection that I ever remember as someone that was growing up, playing Commodore 64 stuff. But of course, tapes were still pretty, they were easy to duplicate. I mean, there was always ways to duplicate cassettes. And disk drives were more advanced. And the early disk drives, like the 1541 and the 1050, they had computers basically built into them. So the 1541 has a 6510 microprocessor built into it. So there's basically a computer within a computer almost. And the thing about these there was a lot more advanced ways of doing copy protection on these early on the early disk drives. And some of the things that developers started to put in were things like intentional disk errors. So they would intentionally put a disk error on the disk, and if there was no error when you copied the game, then you knew it was a copy, so it would fail. There was also other things like extra tracks they put in, long tracks, long sectors. Non-standard signature tracks was another popular one. Weak and fuzzy bit, which is something I'll get to in a couple of slides. But basically, a weak or a fuzzy bit is when the bit itself on the disk can read a 1 or it can read a 0. We're talking about binary 1 or a 0. And that really threw a lot of crackers off their game, I'll say. And there's a good example of that I'll get to. There's also Spyro Disc, which was very popular by Bounty Bob Strikes Back. Spyro Disc is basically when it's reading one particular track and then it kind of goes in between the next track and reads data in between tracks. It was very, very clever. But again, it was something that was easy to defeat. But there was some really, really terrible copy protection out there. And I'm going to talk about a couple of examples. Does anyone know what this is? The lens lock? Got a couple of hands in the crowd there. So the lens lock is probably the worst form of copy protection that I can think of. There's probably some others. But the lens lock basically, first of all, when you would buy the game, it would come with this ridiculous set of instructions on how to use it, right? You just want to play the game. You don't care about, trying to figure out how to use this thing. But what you would basically do is, the game would load and there would be this code of just pixels on the monitor. And what you would have to do is align this lens lock and look through it and basically type in the code as best as what you thought it was. And hopefully, you get 3 attempts, and if you missed out, then it would kick you out of the game. But this was really, really bad. I mean, a terrible idea. It was just a roll of prisms cased in plastic. And there was only 10 games that ever used it. And the most popular one is Elite by David Braben, for those people that may know the game. It was, so if you buy a boxed version of Elite on the Commodore 64 or the Apple or whatever, you'll get one of those lens locks. And if you don't, then you're not going to be able to play the game. So, make sure, if you do buy the game, make sure it comes with a lens lock. And you have to calibrate it as well. And the thing that was really bad was sometimes you would get the wrong lens. There were different lenses for different games. Sometimes you would be given the wrong lens for the wrong game, so you were screwed. I mean, there was nothing you could do at that point other than just return the game and get your money back. Of course, this was easy to crack by crackers. Essentially what they would do is just use a freezer cartridge or something like that, and then go to the section of the code and just basically knock it out or just remove it out. It was pretty easy to defeat. Code Wheels was another popular one. Code Wheels wasn't as bad as the lens lock, but it was still kind of annoying. Basically, it was made kind of famous by LucasArts and SSI that they kind of introduced the Code Wheels. I mean, Code Wheels have been around for a while, but when I think about Code Wheels, I think about the LucasArts early games like Monkey Island and things like that. Code Wheels were interesting because, again, it would come up with 3 different types of characters on the screen, and you had to make your best guess, use the code wheel and line up and find out what was in the middle part of the code wheel, and then type that in or enter that in to get past the game. Again, it wasn't really that difficult to bypass. I remember when I was a kid at school, someone would just basically take their code wheel apart. We would photocopy each of the pieces and then just use a pair of scissors and cut them out and then just replicate the code wheel. But of course, some people don't want to take apart their code wheel if they bought the game. So, there's also that as well. But in the end, it was pretty easy copy protection to defeat anyway. Crackers would easily, get past this. Yeah, and moving on, there's the other one is code cheats. Now, this one is a little more, I guess, this one, I'm not a fan of the code cheats at all. Like the code cheats is basically a variation of the code wheel, but it's basically type in the letters or the characters in section A, number 4 on that red piece of paper there. And they made it look like this so you couldn't photocopy it. Back in those days, photocopying, it wouldn't really translate very well on a photocopy. And this was their way of stopping you from, making a copy of the code sheet. The other one is it's a variation of the code sheet, which is the color. Type in this color that represents, the row and number that you're going for. And again, this one is a variation of the code sheet, but it's also, if you're colorblind or if you're having trouble looking at colors, this is almost insulting in some ways, that they would provide this to you. But they did, and it came on the game Jet Set Willy that came out for the ZX Spectrum back in the day. Now, I was an Amiga guy, and the Amiga was piracy heaven. I mean, there were programs that would crack protection for you. So you would use Xcopy, and you would put your original game in. And I'm not saying it cracked everything, but it had a pretty good success rate. It would basically crack most of the games for you. And there were so many of these kind of copy programs that you could use. But the most popular form of protection on the Amiga, and indeed the ST and MS-DOS, was developed by a gentleman named Rob Northern. You may have heard Rob Northern Protection or Rob Northern Compression before. He did a lot of this stuff. Basically what he did was he obfuscated a 32-bit key in a long disk sector, in basically an unreadable sector on the disk. There was a 32-bit key, and the floppy drives could easily read this sector, but you couldn't write it without expensive mastering equipment. So the kind of average copier wouldn't be able to do it. And it was pretty successful for him. Obviously, he used that in a lot of different games, over 2,000 games. And it stopped the casual copying again, but it didn't really stop the cracking groups, you know, the hardcore cracking groups, because they would just use a freezer cartridge, which I kind of talked about before. A freezer cartridge is basically something that you would install into your Amiga, or Commodore 64 had them. A lot of the popular 8 and 16-bit machines had freezer cartridges, and it will literally just freeze the entire contents of the computer. So you could look at the memory, you could look at the registers, you could look at the disk sectors. So it was very, very easy to crack with one of these things. And the crackers like to rub it in, you know, they would crack the game and then, you know, slap on one of their intros in front of the game to say, hey, we cracked your game, you know, better luck next time. Now, piracy was a huge problem on the 16-bit machines and MS-DOS, and game companies tried many different ways to defeat, but most of them had failed. And another one that comes to mind is Robocop 3. It actually had a dongle that plugged into the joystick port, and it basically had what they used, like self-modifying code or something, to really kind of throw the crackers off. But I talked to a gentleman that works for the cracking group Fairlight, and he cracked the game in about 3 hours. So in the end, it really didn't stop anything. He managed to defeat the game pretty easily. But it didn't stop these companies trying different ways to defeat the protection, to copy protect their games. But the best way, and a lot of game developers figured this out later, the best way to mitigate piracy, you're never going to stop piracy, right? But you can mitigate it. And the best way to do it is to convince the pirate they've cracked the game, but they haven't cracked the game. And we're going to look at a couple of examples of this. And I made a video on this, but the one that really that comes to mind is Dungeon Master. Dungeon Master was a first-person dungeon crawler game that came out back in like 86 or 87. It was developed by FTL, and it used fuzzy and weak bit protection. It had two forms of protection. So there was the fuzzy and weak bit protection, and there was also an unreadable sector on the disk. And essentially what happened was the crackers focused on the unreadable sector because they thought, well, if we can figure out what's on the unreadable sector, then we've cracked the game. And they thought that they defeated the protection. And here's an example of one guy that said, you know, after 4 days, I've done it. But the problem is, they didn't know anything about the fuzzy bit protection. The fuzzy bit is when the disk reads either a 0 or a 1 on the disk. And when this happens, when you make a copy of the game, it's always going to read a 0. That bit is always going to read a 0, or it's always going to read a 1, depending on the reader did when it copied the disk. So every crack seemed to work, but after a few hours, all this weird stuff started happening. So you were playing the game, everything was fine, but maybe a few hours into the game, you know, everything just stopped. So you'd throw like a throwing weapon in the air and it would just suspend in the air, or you couldn't open a door, or you couldn't attack the monsters. The game would just mess with you. And you were really, you know, these crackers were really confused. They were like, well, why is this happening? Maybe it's just a bug in the game. And then they realized that it wasn't, that there was something else at play here. And it took a whole year for the game to be finally cracked. And a whole year in a life cycle of game sales is, you know, it's a lifetime. So they made a lot of money on that game. The protection stayed intact for a whole year before it was finally defeated. So we talked about computers, but what about game consoles? There's a lot of stuff to cover here as well. But the first one that I remember is the NES had the Cic Lockout Chip, and this was basically a chip that was on every NES cartridge, and there was a corresponding Cic chip in the NES itself, and it was like a key lock paradigm. So the key would kind of fit into the lock, and if there was a match there, they would send signals to each other, and if everything was in sync, then it was an original game. Now, it took 20 years to reverse engineer the chip, but it wasn't that difficult to defeat. There was you could literally just cut a few pins and then kind of circumvent the 10 NES Cic. But Nintendo wised up, and they knew that people were doing this, so they came up with other ways to stop people trying to circumvent the Cic chip. And then there was disc copiers on the Super NES. This is I think it's the Super Wildcard here, and this was basically a floppy disk copier that you would fit into the cartridge port, and it ran its own BIOS, and you could make copies of any cartridge you wanted. But again, sometimes you would see a message like this when you made a copy of the game, and that's because every Super NES game that has a battery backup has what's called SRAM. And the amount of SRAM it has is a lot smaller than what is on a disk copier. A disk copier usually has a lot of, say, RAM or SRAM on the copier. So when the SRAM didn't match, then this screen would come up. They knew that you were running some type of copier. Now, Earthbound, this one is a good one. Earthbound actually had 4 layers of protection. The first one was region protection, so when it would say this is not designed for your region system. The second one was the SRAM, as mentioned, the copiers. So if you were using a copied version, or if you're running a copier, it would come up with the screen there. But there was also stuff in the game that would really mess with you. If you somehow managed to defeat 1 and 2, then you would get things like increased encounters, where it would make it very, very difficult for you to proceed into the game. But let's assuming that you did proceed into the game and you got to the final battle against Gygus. Through the battle of Gygus, the Nintendo would reset itself, and then when you came back into the game, it would completely delete your save file. So that's Nintendo messing with you pretty good. So Earthbound was an interesting one, and there are a couple of other examples of kind of save file deletion. And there was some on the Genesis as well. The TMSS screen is the kind of Sega trademark, and that's what they used to have in their memory locations when you would plug in a Genesis cartridge. And again, they would check for the TMSS screens. Landstalker is another game that would basically erase your progress pretty much at random. You would play through the game and hit a save point, and it would just erase your save file, buy an original copy of the game and stop, using backups. Now, eventually consoles stopped coming out on cartridge and started to come out games started to come out on CDs. Now, when the PlayStation 1 came out, you could easily copy a PlayStation 1 disc. You put a PlayStation 1 disc into a PC, you can read every single file off that disc. It's completely unencrypted, you can look at the entire file system. But the PlayStation 1 had what was called a wobble groove, and that was just another kind of variation on an unreadable, it's a readable sector, or it's a readable track on the CD, but it's something that cannot be burnt with a regular CD burner. And one of the most popular stories is about Spyro the Dragon. Again, it seems like you can play through the game just fine, but eventually you'll get to a point where it will say, you seem to be playing a hacked copy of this game. And the game got more and more difficult to play, to the point where you couldn't complete the game. Although I have heard stories where someone managed to beat the game with a completely hacked copy of the game. I'm not sure how they managed to do that, but somehow they did, and that's pretty interesting. Now, the PlayStation 2 was much more advanced than the PlayStation 1. It had the wobble groove that the PS1 had, but it also had other stuff. It had basically 3 levels of additional protection put in. There was the PlayStation 2 logo, and when you load up PS2 game, you see the PlayStation 2 logo pop up. That's actually embedded on each game disc. It's not actually in the firmware of the system. So that logo is encrypted onto the disc. And basically you have to go through a couple of levels of security in order to decrypt that logo and have it display. And if you manage to kind of get through those, then you can play the game. But it didn't really stop the mod chip makers and things like that with the PlayStation 2. The PS2 was a very widely pirated system, as we know. But one really interesting story there is about the PlayStation 2 is, you probably remember these discs, these action replay discs. You put it in a PlayStation 2, you load it up, and there's like a cheat menu, which game do you want to cheat on, and you would pick the game, and then you would put the original disc in, and then you would play the game with the cheats. The interesting question is, these discs were unlicensed, 100% unlicensed. Sony had nothing to do with them. In fact, they didn't like the fact that they were making these action replay discs. So how do you have an unlicensed, unofficial disc boot on a retail PlayStation 2 without a mod chip? And there was something I always wanted to know the answer to, and I actually found out the answer to it. So I reached out to someone that worked at Daytel, and apparently, this is a true story, apparently what they did was they physically cut out the security sectors from Crazy Taxi, and they stuck it onto their discs, and that's how they sold the discs. So, and I know a lot of people were like, that's a ridiculous story. If you take an action replay disc and put it into a PC, it'll say Crazy Taxi on there. They actually cut the sectors from an original PlayStation 2 game and used it on the action replay. So every action replay disc out there, has sectors from Crazy Taxi. It's amazing. And they got so good at it, they refined the process. And I remember asking the question, because I didn't believe it myself. I was like, this sounds ridiculous. I said, how did they do it? And apparently the first attempts were with a hacksaw. They literally just used a hacksaw and cut around the sectors until they got it right, and it worked. And yeah, it shows up as Crazy Taxi on a PC. Later on, they used sophisticated cutting tools, and it worked. And Sony was not happy at all. And I think they tried to stop action replays, being sold, and they took Daytel to court. But I mean, you can still buy action replay discs even to this day for different systems. So they didn't really succeed there, I guess. Now, a lot of people think that Dreamcast didn't have any copy protection, but it actually isn't true. I mean, if you think of it, GD-ROMs are unreadable on anything other than a Dreamcast. And you couldn't make a copy of it unless you had like a development kit and, GD-ROM burner or something. But the problem was there was an exploit found on the Dreamcast, the MIL CDs, which was the kind of those multimedia discs that came there's only like 5 of them that came out in Japan, I think. Space Channel 5 is kind of the most popular one that had the add-on MIL CD that came out. And that was really the exploit that managed any CD to be burnt and read on a Dreamcast. So it was patched out eventually on, I think it was like the 2nd or 3rd revision of the Dreamcast, but by then it was too late. I mean, if you buy a Dreamcast, there's a pretty good chance you can just use it as and run backups on it pretty easily. Now the GameCube's an interesting one because it uses the mini DVDs, which is, I think it's like 1.4 gigabytes of storage size. And they have what's called BCAs, which is the burst cutting area. And that was an area on the disc, again, where a expensive writer equipment, mastering equipment, would literally just put these kind of markings on the disc that was something that you could not do with a regular DVD burner or a CD burner at the time. And again, GameCube discs were completely unreadable on a PC. If you put a GameCube disc in a PC, you can't even read it. It doesn't even detect anything. And once again, our friends Daytel managed somehow to release an action replay cartridge, action replay disc for the GameCube. But essentially what they did this time was they realized the kind of challenge response that was going on. So when you put the disc in, there's like a challenge response that authenticates against the console, and if all the checks and balances work out, then it's an original copy of the game and it boots into the game. Now, the thing with the GameCube is that mod chips came out pretty early on. So with a mod chip, they had managed to find a way to just basically dump the boot process in memory and understand what was going on. So in the end, they just essentially just emulated the boot process, the BCA or the burst cutting area authentication check, without the need of actually expensive DVD mastering. And this was the way that an Action Replay GameCube disc will boot on a GameCube without a mod chip. And it's the same thing. So Daytel had some really smart people that had different ways of defeating these protections. They had some really smart individuals doing that stuff. Now, the original Xbox had two partitions. It has the movie partition, which is the one where if you put the disc into a PC, thinking that you can just read the disc because it's just an Xbox is a PC, that's what everyone says, it'll just play a little movie, or it'll show some text about this is an Xbox game, put it into an Xbox. But the hidden data is on partition 2, and partition 2 is only unlocked when you put the disc into an Xbox, or if you have a mod chip which completely just unlocks partition 2 and basically turns off partition 1. And this is what you get when you put a Xbox original disc and a 360 disc into a PC. But again, cracking groups back then, they used custom firmwares, and with the right custom firmware, flashing it onto a PC DVD drive, a DVD reader, you could easily rip these discs without needing an Xbox. And this is the way that the cracking groups used to release these games and beat the competition. They didn't even use the Xbox at all because it was much too slow to do that. They would just use a fast PC at the time. Now, a couple of other choice points here. The Sega Saturn, which I don't cover in this talk because there's so much it's like I could talk for another hour about the Sega Saturn, so I won't. But it took over 20 years to defeat. Dr. Abrasive has done some work there, finally defeating it. And I got to say, I want to learn more about the Sega Saturn copy protection before I talk about it. Like I don't feel like I'm skilled enough on that topic because there's a lot of stuff to cover there. The NES, Super NES, and Nintendo 64 all use the same CIC. Not the same physical chip, but a variation of the same Cic Lockout. And the last point here is there is actually no copy protection on the Sega CD, 3DO, Amiga CD32, and Philips CDI, so you can easily just make backups of these discs without any repercussions at all. It'll just work. So that's really what I had. I want to take questions from you guys. Hopefully, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask.
Yeah, I was wondering, do you think there's any connection between any of the game systems that have successful copy protection and the successfulness of them? Because I noticed like the 3DO and the CD32 really weren't that successful.
I mean, I think that there's an investment in time and money that needs to go into security, and the ones that didn't put copy protection in, I agree with you. I mean, all those systems kind of failed. I mean, all of them didn't do very well. So I think there's definitely a correlation there for sure. I do agree with you. You there?
Do you count it really as copy protection? I mean, it's kind of related to the sort of feely copy protection things that you listed toward the beginning, but when PC games of a certain vintage, like Interplay's Lord of the Rings Volume 1 game, would just have large amounts of game content not in the game at all, but in like a book that came with it that you had to reference.
Yeah.
I mean, that was like a form as well.
Yeah, for sure. Like the Novella Protection, which is kind of a variation of the, I guess, the code wheel and the code. You would get, I think you're talking about like, those early Lord of the Rings games, like The Hobbit and stuff. You get these like big, basically a book, right, that you would read that came with the game. And you would play through the game and eventually would say, hey, type in the code on page 4, paragraph 3 or something like that.
well, in the case of the Lord of the Rings Volume 1 game, anytime there was something in the game that happened that had a significant amount of text, the text just wasn't in the game at all. It
Right.
would just say, C paragraph number.
Yeah.
And then you had a big book with all those paragraphs, so that if you didn't have that book, you just had no idea what was going on most of
Right.
the time.
Yeah. Yep. Good point. Anyone else? You there?
So, the CIC protection on console for the NES, do you still put like what was the thing for today? Turn it off on the other console or no?
For the CIC? Yeah, you can. Yeah. Yep. You can, the SNES you can, the Nintendo 64 you can't. It's a little more complicated. The N64 CIC protection, they finally figured out that, hey, you know, this isn't really going to work for us anymore, just cutting pins. The Nintendo 64 one is actually quite complicated because there's no CIC on the Nintendo 64 itself. There's the PIF chip, the PIF chip. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on between those two chips there. So.
And does the DS have a different console protection?
On the DS? Yeah, that's another thing that I'm going to add to this slide deck eventually. I want to learn more about the DS protection because there's a lot of stuff to cover there. It's a lot more complicated than people think. I mean, people think it's easy just to mod the DS, which it is, but it took them a long time to figure it out. So, right at the back there.
Did you use similar stuff for handheld consoles like Game Boy or Sega one?
Did they use similar stuff for handheld consoles? They didn't use like the CIC for the handheld consoles. The handheld consoles was interesting because Nintendo really made some mistakes with the way that they did things because they would always have, like the Game Boy Advance would play Game Boy and then, you know, the DS would play Game Boy Advance. So it kind of took the mistakes they made of the previous version of the console forward into the new one. So usually the weak points was the exploits they found with the Game Boy Advance with the DS, and that was the earliest methods of the ways that they managed to defeat the copy protection. And then once they realized how to boot the game into DS mode, then they finally went from there. But I think, yeah, I mean, handhelds are definitely a different animal for sure, but there's some topics there that I want to cover in a future slide deck for sure. So.
For the fuzzy bit copy protection, what was preventing legitimate copies?
Which one?
The fuzzy bit, like the 0-1, you couldn't.
So the fuzzy bit protection is you either read a 0 or a 1, and basically what would happen is if you made a copy of a game that had fuzzy bit, it would either write to the copy a 1 or a 0. So the game developers knew if that bit always read a 1 or always read a 0, you're playing a backup of it. You know what I mean? And then they would start messing with you in the game. They wouldn't tell you, hey, you're playing a backup or whatever. You would play a few hours into the game and then they would start messing with you. And then you realize that you hadn't defeated the protection.
So the fuzzy bit, right? It gets written at like weekly to that. I mean, does it? I'm going to ask. Does it get written weekly to the disk? And if so, do legitimate disks break after like 20 years?
Well, I mean, bit rot is real, so yeah, I mean, absolutely. The fuzzy bit gets written to the disk when they master the disk, and it will either read a 1 or a 0. It's like a dice roll almost, because, and I don't know the actual, the way that they do it, but it basically, it's kind of indeterminate, and that's really, what it is. But your point about bit rot is real. I mean, eventually these disks are going to stop working.
I would think that would actually fail on real games occasionally too, because it'd have to track it over time.
Yeah, and that's a good point. There's a lot of false positives that come out of that. Like, so someone will buy an original game that has fuzzy bit, and they'll get messed with. They'll have to endure the copy protection as well, and they'll have to send the game back or whatever. You there?
Yeah. How do emulators handle fuzzy bits then? Since they're deterministic?
I mean, most emulators are just hard-coded to know that, if I'm loading Dungeon Master, if I'm loading game X, I know that I'm just going to patch this out. So they just kind of hard-code it out, basically. You there?
Did the Bloomcast discs
on Dreamcast, did those utilize the same mil-CD exploit?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they did. And if you have an original Gleamcast disc and you like the dual case, it will have like mil CD on there. So. You there?
So what methods of copy protection do we still see, like, that was started way back then and continues now? Like, would we still see things like the fuzzy bit?
Not really. These days, because the thing is, it's a good question too. These days, I mean, everything's always online, you know, so it's almost like, I mean, there's de novo and stuff like that, which I don't know anything about de novo, and that's not something I'm going to cover here, but most games these days, you have to be connected somewhere, right? They're always connected. So it's very, very easy for the server to detect whether you're playing an original version or not. So apart from those things, I mean, most of these methods now that I talked about, none of them are really being used anymore, because this is all kind of physical media type stuff, so nothing's really carried over. You at the back there with the hat, the one that you put your hand out, yeah.
The game that you helped port to the Xbox, the Skyrim game, I can't remember the name of it.
Freefall 3050 AD,
Does
yeah.
that just apply the copyright protection in the Xbox, or does it bypass it? How's that work?
So you did the gentleman was talking about Freefall 3050 AD. I released a original Xbox game a couple of months ago. I worked with the developer of the game originally, and we released it. That needs a modded Xbox, so it's not an official, you know, mastered version of the game or anything. You need a modded Xbox to play it.
For someone who's more interested in learning about the Sega Saturn copyright protection, where would you recommend going?
I would probably start with Dr. Abrasive's video. He's done an amazing, like he kind of goes through everything about the start of his journey on what he did and where he ended. So I think if you check out, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, I can send you the link after this, but he did an amazing video on everything from start to finish. So yeah, I would say start there for sure. You there?
Continuing off the Freefall 3050 AD thing, do you think it would be possible to like rebuild the copy protection to that game? And if so, do you know other instances of people like rebuilding copy protection for their purpose?
Well, yeah, I mean, that was an original Xbox game. So the way that we would probably do that is, but I mean, the thing is, obviously you can't release original Xbox games anymore because you have to go through the certification process.
Yeah.
But if that was something that was possible, let's say, we would probably want to go through that process because we'd rather like release the game officially than, you know, through homebrew circles. But unfortunately, I mean, there's no way you can do that anymore. You right there with the hat, blue hat.
You said that the Sega CD didn't have copy protection. Did Genesis cartridges have copy protection, or did it
Yes. Genesis did have copy protection. Some of the games, like Landstalker was one that I mentioned that would erase save files. Generally speaking, Genesis was a lot more relaxed than the Super NES, but there was definitely copy protection on the Genesis. Yes. You there?
What's your favorite means of copy protection?
What's my favorite means of copy protection?
Yeah.
No copy protection. I mean, it's a good question, but the thing is, it really hurts, you know, video games, because as time passes, sometimes these methods, and I talked about, you know, being online and validating against the server, they're the ones that are really going to hurt, you know, later on. Like Doom, for example, I was pretty vocal about Doom being re-released by Bethesda. You have to log into Bethesda.net in order to validate the game and play the game. A game that came out in 1993, so, and then they took the Xbox Live Arcade versions offline and all that stuff. So I think, you know, no copy protection is definitely the right way to go forward for sure. You there?
Other than the ones you mentioned, do you have any other favorite ways that people mess with you? Like, I believe there's Monkey Island, and one where you didn't pass it, you get the broken tail and just stay there.
For me, I think Dungeon Master is my favorite one. Like, I think because I'm a developer as well, so, you know, thinking about ways of trying to beat the pirates at their own game, I think Dungeon Master is probably the most ingenious one that I've come across. And I've experienced it myself too. Like I was a kid in high school playing that game, and I realized after a few levels there was something wrong with this game. I didn't know what it was, and then I read about later that it was a form of very, very subtle protection. Spyro is another one that was really cool as well. Those kind of passive ones that don't really tell you, and then it's too late. I'm glad I didn't do the Earthbound one because that would have sucked pretty bad. So, you there?
So one I'd like to mention, I think the game was called Game Developer Tycoon, where if you play a pirated copy, in game people would start pirating your game.
Really?
Yeah.
I have to check that out. That's awesome. Yeah, there's some really cool stories out there. The other one I want to talk about in a future talk is about Fade. Have you guys heard about Fade copy protection? It was on the PC in the 90s, and it was one of those things where it would just kind of start messing. The game would get worse and worse over time, but it was really annoying after a while. I got 1 more minute, and I gotta cut this off. So one more question, right there.
Have there been advancements in Sega Saturn emulation recently?
There's been some advancements in Sega Saturn emulation, but Sega Saturn is really hard to emulate, obviously, with the different custom chips and things like that. But it's definitely getting better, but it's nowhere near where it needs to be. So, all right, I'm going to wrap up, guys. Thank you so much for coming to my panel.